Celebrating and Taking Charge of ADHD is an innovative group coaching program incorporating mindfulness as an essential tool throughout. This podcast addresses a number of topics that we face on a day-to-day basis and celebrates the precious human life we have all been given. However, you may be aware of some of the symptoms associated with ADHD that hold us back, so let's take charge of it together. You're listening to episode 9 of the Celebrating ADHD podcast with your hosts, Jono, Godlee and Sue Hart. And we're very lucky to have a special guest on today. His name is Bill Colley. So Bill Colley is a writer, teacher trainer and educational consultant who spent much of his career in the independent sector before becoming the headmaster of a residential special school. He is currently working in local government as a service manager with responsibility for additional support needs and contributes at a local level to an ADHD support group, the NHS Autism Assessment Pathway, and to the National Autism Strategy Reference Group in Scotland. He is an advisor to Mindroom, a Scottish charity for people with learning difficulties, and has a particular interest in improving educational outcomes for children who experience developmental disorders and in supporting their families via multi-professional collaboration. His latest task is to establish a new provision and an authority-wide service for children who have disengaged from mainstream education. Thank you very much for coming on today, Bill.
Hi, thank you for inviting me.
It's great to have you here. And really, we just wanted to learn a little more about what it is that you do. So maybe in a few sentences, would you be able to tell us about what it is that you do and your story?
Sure, I'll try my best in a short period of time. I'm the chair of the Scottish ADHD Coalition, but I'm also vice president of an organisation called UCAP, the UK ADHD Partnership. And I've worked in the field of education and care for longer than I care to remember, in both the maintained sector and the private sector, and in both mainstream schools and in special schools. So I have quite a broad range of experience. And I suppose to capture this in a very small number of words, I became involved probably in about 1999, working with the first child I was able to identify as having what was then called Asperger's syndrome, and realizing that not only did I not know about this thing called autism and the autism spectrum, but I didn't understand anything about neurodevelopmental disorders. And at the time I was working in supporting about 95 residential kids in a privileged school. And despite the fact that it was privileged and well off and well resourced, these were youngsters whose needs weren't being identified and therefore whose needs we were not meeting. So I had to learn quite quickly quite a lot about what was emerging at the time. And as a result of some of the work I was doing, I was invited to take over a special school, and it's really moved on from there. So I've also served on the Scottish Government National Autism Strategy, worked at national level, and I'm an expert witness with a particular interest in special educational needs and disability discrimination.
Fantastic. Wow, what a strong answer that was. And I have to say, it's I think it's great to hear that there's more of an awareness of these subjects today. You know, when you think about how, you know, even I guess, 10, 20 years ago, there wasn't really much or the same level. So I think it's very refreshing to see that people are generally more aware. So...
when I first got involved with ADHD, and in contrast with autism, I came to the conclusion, I suppose it was in the early 2000s, that during my lifetime, we would not make any progress because of the barriers that I was facing at the time. And I'm really pleased to say that I was wrong. And that there has been some progress, that there is, even using terms like neurodiversity now, that there is recognition at all levels that there needs to be some understanding, a better understanding, because it benefits not only the individuals, but society as a whole. And so, I'm wrong from time to time, and I was wrong then.
That's great. Well, that sounds like you've achieved a lot in a short space of time, Bill. That's fantastic. I mean, where can people find out more about that information on the organisation that you've been involved with?
So there are two. There's the Scottish ADHD Coalition, which you'll find on the web and on Facebook, and was set up to primarily support support groups, because what we noticed from autism is that because I was involved at the very beginning, I understood how those campaigning for better recognition and support for autism mobilized themselves, got organized, made contact at political level to such a degree that you have what's happening in both England and Wales and Scotland at the moment, where you have talk about commissioners and autism strategies and even legislation. With ADHD, it's different. Partly because I think of some of the controversies around medication, some of the controversies around, well, does it really exist? Still, surprisingly. And I think the reluctance of politicians to dip the toes into the water sometimes, despite the fact that it crosses so many policy areas, from substance use and offending to unemployment, and et cetera, et cetera. So the Scottish ADHD Coalition was set up to support groups. It's not a support group in itself, or was never intended to be, but it was to help support groups set up so that we could achieve what the autistic community has achieved. And what you will know from experience is that very often people who have a vested interest in autism also find themselves pulled in other directions. They have commitments, they have family members who are struggling, they have difficulties with organisation themselves perhaps, and sustaining these support groups can be very, very difficult. So the coalition was set up really to help local support groups. And UCAP, the UK ADHD Partnership, which can also be found on the web, is a more academic and professional organisation aimed at helping psychiatrists and psychologists to get top quality information, evidence-based information about particular issues such as the crossover between ADHD and fetal alcohol syndrome, gender issues around ADHD, girls with ADHD. And so we publish consensus statements from time to time. And again, a Google search should take you to the UCAP webpage.
Excellent. That's great. Fantastic.
Definitely, yeah. That's and that leads me quite well into my next question, which is really about passion. So Bill, what would you say your passion is, and what really drives you kind of in the area you're working in at the moment?
I think there are two parts to that. One is that as I became involved with ADHD in the pupils I was supporting, so I became aware that ADHD was in my family and probably in me. And so I self-identify as having ADHD. And if I look at some of the challenges that I faced in my life, particularly at school, where I knew I was reasonably intelligent but couldn't do things. I couldn't remember my French vocab. My short-term memory is so poor that I couldn't do a lot of maths things, which actually I now find quite interesting and pleasurable to do. But back then I just thought I was really stupid and beat myself up. So I went through most of my secondary career thinking I was extraordinarily stupid and destined to be a complete failure. And what I have done in going into the education system is over time recognize there are lots and lots of me's in there, of kids who feel undervalued, feel that they're not achieving, obstacles are put in their way, and ultimately it leads to very poor mental health. I think it leads to anxiety and depression and a sense of disconnection with society, when in fact what many of those children and adults have are qualities that, if harnessed in the right way, could be of immense benefit to society. So I have the sense that I'm not entirely sure that politicians have grasped the thorn or the nettle, which is that we don't as a country make the best use of the resources that we have available, by which I mean the people, not the coal or the oil lying in the ground, but the people. And that in many organizations, particularly in the private sector, particularly in the public sector, but also in the private sector, enterprise is not particularly encouraged. And you will find that many people with ADHD are willing to challenge systems, think outside the box, come up with new ways of doing things, and it's almost frowned upon rather than celebrated. Don't rock the boat. This is the way we've always done it. Who are you to come along and challenge? Well, actually, if I was working in an organization as a 60-year-old and someone who was 23 came and said, I think we can do this better, I would say, fantastic, that's why I'm employing you. I want you to come up with these ideas and challenge systems.
Yeah, that's absolutely. Yeah, completely agree with what you're saying there. It's and you've actually kind of answered our next question, which was about how is it viewed, positive and negative. So I guess what there's a couple of questions here. If you could answer these, is but having done some work in Scotland, are there any differences in Scotland to England on how it's viewed within the education sector? And also, just to comment on what Sir Ken Robinson gave a great talk on about schools killing creativity, and just would like to get your thoughts on that. So 2 things, of the comparison between Scotland and England, and then whether you think schools are killing creativity.
Right, so that's a very big question, and we haven't got a huge amount of time available. There are a number of very significant differences between Scotland and England in terms of the curriculum and in terms of the way that resources are allocated. So in England, it seems to be, and I don't know a huge amount about the EHCP system, but education and healthcare plans seem to follow individual children and their needs, whereas in Scotland, that isn't the case. Money is allocated to a school based on some general evaluation of the level of support required in the school. And that makes big differences in types of provision. But also there are differences in the curriculum, and the English curriculum appears to be far more structured, which isn't always to the benefit of kids with ADHD. In Scotland, it in theory is less structured and more open to interpretation and adjustment. But actually, it doesn't happen, as the OECD recently evaluated. So I don't think either country can stand up and say we're doing a really good job with ADHD. There is still a resistance in the profession to understand ADHD. I think it's one of the real difficulties as a consultant involved, is that when I'm called into a case involving a child with autism, I can often make quite a big difference quite quickly by looking at anxiety and looking at the roots of anxiety, sensory difficulties and social demands and so on. But when you're dealing with ADHD, you're often dealing with a lot of legacy issues. So a 13-year-old with ADHD has had 13 years of ADHD and had 13 years of difficulties in relationships, in self-esteem, self-identity, etc., etc. And it's much more difficult to make changes in the environment to support that young person. So I don't think anywhere's got it right. And even in North America, where lots of money has been thrown at ADHD in terms of research, there is still no conclusive evidence to suggest that any one intervention or support strategy in a school is better than anything else. So there's very much a grey area. But what I would say is that whilst there is clearly a biology to ADHD, and pharmacology and medication play a significant role, actually it's the individual person, their self-esteem, their self-belief, their identity, which is critically important. And with medication, you may be able to reduce some symptoms, but what you can't do is repair all the damage that has been done to relationships and to self-esteem. And that requires a lot of imaginative thinking, flexibility, investment, by which I mean primarily time, in young people. And of course, that resource isn't hugely available at the moment in an era of public spending cuts. Mm. So if I would hate to run a school for kids with just ADHD. And that's not because I don't like ADHD, it's just that I think that you need a mix and a blend and opportunities and role models. What I would do is I would have a lot of more outdoor learning, a lot more practical learning. I would encourage the development of critical thinking skills. I would look specifically, and because one population group that we probably won't touch on too much is high ability learners with ADHD. And high ability learners with ADHD can often go through the school system. They hit university and they fail. And that failure at the age of 20, 21 is massive, because they haven't been, first of all, they don't understand where their own difficulties lie in terms of personal organization, timekeeping, et cetera, et cetera. But also it's the first time they failed. So a lot of medical students will fail because they can't keep up with the demands of the course. And so I think we need to teach failure at quite an early age and how to deal with failure, because we're all going to experience it. And it's one of those things that we can say we need to teach handwriting and maths and driving a car and cooking and whatever. But actually we need to, there ought to be a subject on failure.
Yeah, absolutely agree. We had an interview with Tal Ben-Shahar, who's the founder of Positive Psychology in America. So he devised the course for Harvard. And within that course, which I've done myself, it's learn to fail or fail to learn.
Yeah. Yeah, I would agree. So, the central question was, do schools kill creativity? And I'm sad to say, I think they do, because they don't give an opportunity for creativity to be nurtured. And I think it's it's a bit like, it was described to me by someone in my family the other day. It's a bit like having Lego in the house, and you've got different boxes with different models in. And if you say to a child, you've got to put all the Lego pieces back in the original box and put them away, you don't get a hamster driving a train, or you don't get, something wacky. You need wackiness, and you need people, you need humor, and you need people being irreverent and pushing boundaries and doing things that are different. So, my idea of using Lego is you mix everything together and see what emerges, rather than saying, no, you've got the fire station, you have to build a fire station, you've got the fire engine, you have to build a fire. Let the fire station mix with a school or and with different individuals, because that is where you spark creativity and individuality.
Absolutely. And you just have to look at some of the famous people with neurodiversity, let's say that. I mean, without Elon Musk, we wouldn't be able to explore other planets. So
Bill Gates and so on. And the one thing that I think those people, they had a number of things in common when you talk about successful entrepreneurs. One is they had luck. And not everyone with ADHD is going to be lucky or become successful and financially rich, but they very often also had a support in place which allowed them to focus on the things that they were good at, and to not get bogged down with the things that they're not so good at. So I doubt that Richard Branson, for example, spends a huge amount of time doing his accounts. I think he probably says to his accountant, how much money do we have? Can I invest this amount? And that's one way in which we have to make creativity work. So within a school setting, for example, and I think this would really help in terms of transfer of skills to the workplace, is where you're working with a group of kids, is to have an open discussion about where individual strengths lie, and make sure that the imaginative thinking is recognized as a strength as much as the good handwriting or the organizational skills, which will often come to the fore. Those will be seen as the key strengths in tackling any academic problem, whereas actually you need someone to be able to approach a question and think of it in a different way. So another example, and I hope I'm not taking up too much time, but in the Curriculum for Excellence in Scotland, there was one school locally, when I was working in the local authority, decided to do a topic on the Titanic, and there was a lot around the Titanic and class structure and what was going on at the time. And as the topic was being introduced, one of the kids at the back, very ADHD in character, put his hand up and said, if the Titanic was made out of steel, why didn't it sink? Now that came out of the blue. And, but it was an opportunity to say, well, rather than going down the route we've already prescribed, what we will do is look at flotation, and we will look at different substances and the design of it. Now that opportunity could have been missed. And I missed it in a kid when I was teaching geography, way back. And I was talking about the damage caused by earthquakes. And the kid at the back said, sir, why do people live in places where there are earthquakes? And my reaction, being inexperienced and not really being very enlightened, was to say, shut up and get on with writing down the notes that I'm giving you. But actually, that was the most intelligent question that was ever asked in the class. Why do people, you look at risk assessment, you look at what's happening in earthquake areas, and it opens up all sorts of possibilities. So I'm as bad as anyone else. I don't want to imply that I'm a sort of genius in terms of teaching kids with ADHD, but I do think that with creativity, we have to get a lot better about A, recognizing it, and B, nurturing it.
I completely agree. And I think that it's great to see that there are places out there that are presenting an awareness, shall we say, of conditions such as ADHD. Especially for me, I suppose I was quite fortunate growing up because I was able to go to schools that had decent learning support departments, and actually at secondary school, I was saying this earlier, I went to a school that literally had a really good department of people who specialised in helping those with not just ADHD, but all of the other neurodiverse conditions such as dyslexia and dyspraxia. And I think, that I feel very fortunate to have been in that position, and that certainly carried through to when I was at university. And I think I've always been a creative individual, but I think that helped me to increase my own awareness of it and nurture the levels of creativity as well. And I think while I'm on the topic of kind of neurodiverse individuals, one thing I was going to ask you was, have you got any kind of advice for people with neurodiverse conditions at all?
Again, that's such a massive question, isn't it? I think for folk with ADHD, it would be to read, research, understand, look at executive functions, in particular short-term memory, recognize that some of the difficulties that you have are not due to immaturity or lack of ability, that they're just something you're going to have to face, like the fact you might be going prematurely bald, or you might be too short, or it's just something that your genetics has really determined for you to some degree, but also harness the strengths and don't let recognize that people who you look at who seem to be succeeding in life are often not succeeding in life. There's a lot of social media stuff. There's a front, people leading these wonderfully luxuriant lives, but actually mental health affects a huge amount of the population. And the one thing I would say to anyone who's neurodiverse is to separate what the idea of neurodiversity from general mental health or even specific mental health, and get clever, particularly for the ADHD population, but understanding anxiety and depression. Because those are even for the bright, sparky class clown aged 13, who is very disruptive and difficult to manage in school, what you can almost guarantee is by the time they're in their 20s, they're stuck in their room, they're not socializing, they are feeling bad about themselves, and they're going to be a drain on society, but also they're not going to make the most of their life or have a good quality of life. So I think I would certainly say that developing an understanding of your own mental health and your own relative weaknesses is helpful, but also balance that by recognizing strengths. And one of the other key things is stay connected if you can, because the way that or the research into resilience tends to demonstrate that those young people who have adversity in their lives do best when they're connected to a family member who knows them. It doesn't need to be mum and dad. It can be an aunt or an uncle. It could be a grandpa. It doesn't matter. But having that connection with someone that they can trust, having a good friend, and being connected with a group or a community in some ways, those are really important factors, protective factors in terms of resilience. So it's easy to say, make sure you have those things in place. It's more difficult to actually do them. But certainly research, learning, listen to programs like this, speak to other people who are going through something similar, and you'll realize that there is a hell of a lot more of it around than you think, whether it's dyscalculia, whether it's dyspraxia, or whether it's ADHD.
Great advice. Thank you, Bill. And that sort of leads into the current situation, actually, with the pandemic. I mean, how is that affecting the support out there currently?
If we're talking about we can divide it into the school-age population that's obviously been affected by school closures and about restrictions. I can't I don't have enough. I don't think it's been enough research done to be able to draw firm conclusions. Everything's going to be anecdotal, but obviously it's going to have had an impact, and I think we're going to see higher levels of anxiety now. In the last study of child mental health in 2017, one of the things that came through very strongly was that we are underestimating the level of anxiety in the school-age population already. This is pre-pandemic. So what has happened since then, goodness only knows. But I think there's a more general malaise that is connected with a sense of a lack of opportunity. Where am I going to go in the world? What job am I going to do? Is life going to be pleasurable at all? I think there's that sort of general sense of disconnect that is taking place. But then we've also got to look at the mental health services and the impact of the pandemic on them. And I would suggest that it's been enormous. And what I think the evidence suggests, and certainly from personal experience, I would suggest, is that the both CALMS and adult mental health services, they're not so much at breaking point as broken. They've already broken, and they're just trying to keep things together to some degree. So it's very difficult, for example, in Scotland, to get a proper ADHD assessment. It's hard. You've got to jump through so many hurdles. There are so many obstacles placed in the way. And the wait time for CALMS is, it's gone up, bounced back up to, years rather than months. So COVID has had a wide range of impact, some of which will be positive. For some people working from home, conducting interviews by Zoom or meetings by Zoom may suit them a lot better. I know that many members of the autistic community feel that, but I don't want to commit to saying that it's had a dreadful effect. I just think it probably has.
Yeah, no, that's it. I really get what you're saying. I mean, there was a report done by the BBC last year that they were saying it takes 7 years to get a diagnosis on the NHS. And I'm also hearing from people that are doing the course that, they're going to go private because they got a letter the other day and their assessment will be in 2 years' time.
Yeah. But you also, I think there's another problem called diagnostic overshadowing, where a child will get a diagnosis of autism, for example, and because they have that frontline headline diagnosis, people don't think around the child as a whole. And there are a number of cases I've dealt with where a child does have autism, but they also have ADHD, and the ADHD part is treatable, and by treating the ADHD, you can make a significant impact on quality of life. So what I think is wrong at the moment is when you make a referral to CALMS, you almost channel down one route way or another, rather than someone right at the very beginning saying, let's form a general view on what's happening with this child. Is it a family situation? Is it a neurodevelopmental disorder? Or are there several neurodevelopmental disorders? Because what we know, and what you'll know almost as a mantra, is that comorbidity is the norm. It's normal to have ADHD and something else. 70–80% of people with ADHD will tend to have, let's call it complex ADHD, because of the impact of another disorder or condition.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think what you shared about anxiety is so true. And there's been a study done in Israel recently about COVID, and the result is that people with ADHD are 50% more likely to contract COVID through anxiety.
Right. There are some studies from North America looking at there is an overrepresentation of the ADHD population in terms of contracting COVID. The exact reasons for that are not clear. Is it because people are not following rules? Is it because they're forgetting? Is it all those ADHD characteristics that lead them into situations where they're more likely? And I don't think there's a firm answer yet. But as we know from accident and emergency admissions, the prevalence rates in terms of limb fracture are higher in the ADHD population because they tend to take more risks, and it's likely that we are a risk group and a vulnerable group. That's true.
Yeah, absolutely. The risk taking is one of the main personality traits that the scientists have identified, isn't it? Yeah. Jono.
So my question to you, Bill, was because I know you've got a lot of experience in this field, but I wanted to really ask, has there been a time or an experience when you've been supporting someone with special needs that's really kind of resonated with you?
Do you mean generally or specifically in relation to ADHD?
I would probably say in relation to ADHD. Yeah.
Yeah, and I have to go way back to the very beginning when, as I said to you, I was working in a mainstream school and became more sensitized to the evidence around me that the children who were different And we tended to think of those children who are different as we automatically, in those days, blamed the parents. So it's a single mum, or it's all those things, which I shudder now at my naivety and how judgmental that was. And there was one young man who, yeah, he was very, very, very ADHD, and it was a difficult conversation to have because people weren't really talking about it at the time. It's very difficult to talk to a parent and effectively say, I think your child has a mental health disorder. Just the terminology is so clumsy and difficult to get over. But it was when I was dealing with that child and looking through the diagnostic criteria that I realized that my own son had ADHD, and we'd been struggling with him for a long period of time. So rather than it being a pupil I was working with, it was my own son. Now we have spoken on record about how it's affected our relationship, how difficult it was for him, how difficult it was for me as a parent. And it's worth listening to. There's a podcast somewhere on the internet. I'll get you the location at some point. But conducting that interview is one of those where you're speaking to a member of your own family about something you probably don't normally go into as a father and son, and realizing that his perception of things was very different from my perception of things, and vice versa. And that, small things that you say and do can have a very, very big impact. And it's something that I've impressed upon teachers, certainly in the latter years of my career, is the power of a teacher to positively influence a child by saying or doing the right thing. And you can turn, as a teacher, you have the power to turn a child's life around. But it's also true, working in staff rooms with colleagues, you can do the same to your colleagues, because as surprising as it may be, within schools, there are teachers with autism, there are teachers with ADHD, a lot of teachers with ADHD, and you can do a lot of good by being knowledgeable and applying positivity to your interactions with others.
Definitely, yeah, no, that's a very, very strong answer right there. And I think it's also interesting to kind of focus on, so obviously there's maybe the young adult, shall we say, that may be dealing with the effects of say ADHD kind of on their end, but I suppose it's also interesting to think about how that affects the parent as well. Certainly when I was growing up, my parents were very kind of on the ball, should we say, about going down the specific routes, because my dad, he's a GP anyway, but I think that probably helped to kind of work out exactly what needed to be done and who to go to and who to see. So I think it's always just interesting to bear in mind, in addition to how it may affect, the young adult, also to think about the how the parents may be feeling as well about the diagnosis. So,
you asked me earlier about my passion, and one of the areas of work that I'm involved in is the care system, and I see a lot of kids who end up in the care system because they are not necessarily fully understood, nor are the parents. And I get very angry, I get very emotional, very angry about parents being judged when what you're seeing is a family that is often in crisis because the child is putting so much pressure on the family through their need, and not obviously deliberately, but because of their needs, they're putting a lot of pressure on the parents. The parents may not have the knowledge that they need, and other professionals will instantly judge it as being poor parenting rather than a skills deficit or a knowledge deficit. So first of all, those kids shouldn't end up in the care system. They should end up staying with their families, but with support. But I also think that it's important to recognize the impact on the mental health of the parents and the resilience of the parents. You need your parents to be strong. If you've got ADHD, ODD, conduct disorder, autism, your parents need to be strong people. And anything that undermines their strength is going to undermine your long-term future. But then the other population group to consider is siblings. So a sibling who maybe doesn't have ADHD but is living in a family with ADHD, they will often suffer poorer mental health and poorer outcomes. Not something that generally arises in conversation, because it sounds as if you're attributing blame to the affected sibling, but you're not. You're just saying that we have to understand these complex family dynamics.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I think what you're saying is, yeah, understanding the bigger picture, the social context and the environment that the child is in is about taking this holistic approach. And it's not about blame. It's about what is. That is the situation, and it's affecting everything. There's always after an action, there is a reaction. There's a consequence to everything around us. So to understand the bigger picture is essential.
I think we need to be very, very clear about the difference between correlation and causation and association. And so in families affected by substance use, where the parents are substance users, rather than instantly going in and saying you're a bad person because you're using cannabis or other narcotics, or you're drinking, and your child, is having problems as a result. Sometimes what you're seeing is a child with ADHD with parents with undiagnosed ADHD who haven't done well in the education system or economically, who are using substances because they're self-medicating. And actually, the route and the cheapest, most cost-effective route to addressing that problem is not to put, give huge amounts of benefits or put all sorts of supports in place, but is actually to work with the family, identify the strengths, because often these are very loving families, very, 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 very loving parents who are struggling. And rather than putting them down, is saying, let's find a way of working with them. One of which may well be, in some cases, identifying and assessing the ADHD early in both the child and in the parent.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we know that there's research that it's can be hereditary, and what I'm seeing, a general observation is that, because I belong to a lot of ADHD groups, Facebook groups and things like that, and some of them are with the parents, and the parents are sort of sharing about their children, but there's no kind of reflection about their life or what's happened to get to this situation. And if they were able to have the support and realization, then that would be a great way to connect with the children, because it's not saying, oh, you're broken. It's saying, actually, I think I've kind of experienced something similar.
Yeah, I think I don't want this to be taken the wrong way, but I worked with autism support groups and ADHD support groups, and I noticed quite a big difference between them in smoking. So you go to an ADHD group and you find quite a lot of the parents will smoke, and it's not necessarily true that's anecdotal and it's not judgmental. It's just something I've observed. But working with a couple of local ADHD support groups in Scotland, what one of them has done in particular is set up a support group which is aimed at the family, not the child, the family. And what has happened in that group is that parents have become, they've obviously gone to for help to the group. They've then become members of the group. They've then become volunteer workers with the group. They've done training. They deliver training. They deliver mentorship and support to others. And through that process, they come to realize a lot of them have then gone on to get assessments and diagnoses for both ADHD and autism themselves. And it's got to be in the right sort of atmosphere that this is nurtured. But I think the principal thing that I like about the group is they see parents as a resource, not as a drain.
Yeah, absolutely. Because we are all connected. At the end of the day.
Yeah.
So if my father's suffering or my mother's suffering, then I'm suffering.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Wow, Bill, we could talk for a long time. I get the feeling that there's an in-depth sense of knowledge and experience there, and I'd love to go on, but we do need to kind of wrap it up. And there was one question I wanted to ask you, and then I think Jono's got the final one. And it was really one, because I was looking at your website and I noticed that Rory Bremner was one of the patrons. Have you met Rory, and have you had a conversation with him about ADHD?
Yes, there's only so much I'm willing to say, but I was presenting at a conference in Glasgow, and I think it was 2010, and Rory arranged to meet with me after I'd done my presentation, and was talking, he wanted to know more about ADHD. Now at that time, he wasn't diagnosed himself, and he was inquiring about other people he knew, let's put it that way. And then during the course of the conversation, I was talking about him, and this is a guy with a very, very sharp brain. He's doing he's translating operas from Italian into English. He's writing comedy shows. He's doing a huge amount. And so I just started talking about it and saying, I said, look, I predict that when you do a gig, you leave the gig, it's fantastic to be able to look forward to it, to actually deliver it. And then you walk away and, you get this great sense of elation and achievement. And then the next day you're as flat as a pancake. And you need to keep feeding this dopamine hit. And it takes you in all sorts of directions. And of course, the directions for an adult with ADHD can take you changing jobs, relationships, substances, all that sort of thing. But with Rory, we just talked about it. And then later I found out that he had gone and got his diagnosis. And he has done a huge amount of good, because he's one of the very first, I suppose, celebrities or high profile people to come out and say, look, I've got ADHD, it's not the end of the world. We need to do more about it and need to understand more about it. So I admire him hugely and take my hat off to him. But yeah, I had that strange experience of him interviewing me for a radio program, would you believe it, in his hotel room all those years ago.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. Fantastic. Well, look, if you are on good terms with him, please invite him. Perhaps we can have him on the podcast one day. I think it would be lovely to have you back again, because there's a lot more that we could talk about, I think. So thank you very much for sharing. Jono.
So just last but not least, I thought I'd just kind of hand the floor over to you, Bill, and ask is there any information that you would like to share with our listeners? And maybe if you want to kind of point them in the direction of your website so they can find out more, would you like to maybe share a little bit about that?
Well, yeah, I'm not so keen to promote myself necessarily, but I think it's there are a lot of, you've got to be very, very careful, because on the web, there is a lot of what I would say was very poor material around weekly research material. There are people with very strong opinions about ADHD, strong opinions about medication, and somewhere in between the different opinions, there is the truth, and you've got to be very, very careful. So I know a lot of people get very anxious, just as they are doing about vaccines and the COVID and everything else. But and it's sometimes difficult to know where to look. But there are reputable websites. I would say that the ADHD Foundation website is good. Scottish Coalition website is okay, but is about to be expanded. Perth and Kinross ADHD Support Group has a good website with lots of information. And I think that we've just got to be very, very careful about the quality of information that we have. But I suppose one of the key messages for me is that, first of all, we need to reframe ADHD as it's not about bad boys. It's not about naughty boys in school. It goes a lot further than that. And a lot of women are affected, and that's not being recognised to their detriment. I think we've got to look at the positives of ADHD and make society, or encourage society, to be far more willing to harness the skills and the strengths that we bring, even if that can sometimes be challenging, because we might well say, excuse me, you're doing this wrong. But if we don't say it, then it's never going to be found out. And even if we are wrong, at least it's healthy for someone to be able to challenge the system in some ways. But I would also, I think the third and perhaps final point is that we've got to understand that yes, there is a biology to ADHD. We don't fully understand it, but we're getting a better understanding. But actually, we've got to look at the human being, and each human being, whilst they may have ADHD and share certain common characteristics, they are individual, and it's always going to require an individualized approach. So when you're trying to work out the best education system or care system, it's not going to be a system. It's going to be somewhere where individuality is recognized, and people are recognized as individuals. That's the key point I'm making. It's not just about a diagnostic label. It's not just about a condition. It's about individual human beings.
I couldn't agree more. And I think, we all have unique skills and talents that can really be harnessed. And I think it is just about encouraging, individuals, especially with neurodiverse conditions, to really, notice them, become aware of them, and then use them to their advantage. So no, I couldn't agree more. And I think we've come up to the end of today's episode. So, Bill, I just wanted to thank you for coming on and giving us your time. And I'm sure that we can pick this back up and maybe do a part 2
Sure.
of the interview at some point. But thank you so very much. And that's it. This has been the Celebrating ADHD podcast with myself, Jono, Godlee, and Sue Hart, and our very special guest, Bill Colley. And that's it for this week. And we'll see you all very soon. Thank you for downloading. You've been listening to the Celebrating ADHD podcast, empowering people to reach their full potential. Celebrating ADHD works best combined as a holistic treatment program, so we advise you to consult your health specialist for medical advice. If you are not sure if you have ADHD, please get in touch, as we can recommend a medical expert, as the diagnosis is all part of the journey. One of the best ways to take charge of your ADHD is through connecting with others that have ADHD too. Please follow us on the Celebrating ADHD Facebook page, Instagram and Twitter, or join the members area at www.celebratingadhd.com.